Welcome to the Urbanization through the late 19th, early 20th century lecture. If you look at your handout, which is in PDF form, you'll see that I've provided a thesis, Rapid Industrialization and Accumulations, Concentrations of Capital, intensified urban spatial development in three significant ways. The geographic topography of cities was altered, technological processes made construction more efficient and materially cheap, and architects either resisted the new expressions of building or formulated new language to express corporate dominance within the American city. To start, we look at data, and it's good to take a couple of these numbers down. The population in the United States was more than half rural, agrarian, living in an agricultural situation before the turn of the century. This shifts, and more than half are living in cities by the beginning of the 20th century. This with immigration and migration of labor from the farm into the city, where labor becomes wage labor in factories and heavy industry, results in the dramatic changes in what we're looking at in front of us in terms of population. So we constantly call these push-pull factors, but in terms of an economic analysis, there is a long-standing shift beginning in Europe, where common lands, agricultural lands, are gradually taken away from small-time farmers, sometimes by force, sometimes through legislation, and this pushes the former rural agrarian worker into a state where they have to sell their labor in industrial settings. And some of these cities dramatically changed between 1870 and 1900. So just take a couple of seconds to record a couple of these pieces of data. It's always good to have them at hand in your notes so that when we reach the end of the unit, you're able to produce some in a question and answer assessment or even a research paper. So you can pause and take a couple down and then restart. You'll see on your handout that there's a space that provides you with a space to copy this map. Now, I'm not asking you to copy every single little street and block, but what I'm interested in having you do is take note of the fact that Boston literally topographically changes throughout the 18th and 19th century. If you look at the original map, the 1733 Bonner map, I'm outlining it right now in red. You will notice that the actual size of Boston has expanded dramatically. And this is due to engineering, landfill, and a variety of other developments over that 200-year period, shaving down the hills in the Boston Common, particularly Beacon Hill. And you can see here that the Back Bay was actually at one point in time a bay, which is where the name of the neighborhood comes from. So what you actually see happening here is land reclaimed from water, from sea. At times, Boston, in its early years, would become an island, and the pathway connecting it, which is in the Back Bay, would be covered by water. Usually, that pathway was like a land bridge that it had about two roadways for passing traffic at the time. Here is an image of the shaving down of Beacon Hill, which was actually higher than the State House. Today, this landmass is no longer there, and there's actually a steep decline from the State House down into the Common. The State House was designed by Charles Bulfinch, who also oversaw some of the land development in these parts of the city. He was part of a group called the Mount Vernon Proprietors, and eventually this went bankrupt and he landed himself in debtor's prison. But Bulfinch was a remarkable architect that reintroduced classical styles, historical styles of building to the Boston, the city, and built a tremendous, he was very prolific as an architect. He built a tremendous amount of structures in the city. Here's an image from Beacon Hill looking out over the Back Bay. And here is a contemporary image overlooking the same location. So you can see that many of Boston's most recognizable structures, tallest buildings happen to be built, and nicest neighborhoods happen to be built on this reclaimed land. Now, to begin our discussion of what the built environment looks like, we have to increase some of our vocabulary. And a fine example of the classical style of architecture is the State House, which I had indicated was designed by Charles Bulfinch with extensions that were designed by later architects. But before we get to that, I just want you to consider the characteristics of the city on your handout, the idea of the megapolis, the introduction of mass transit, the magnet for economic and social opportunities, the intensification of class distinctions, the inner and outer core of the city. So you have the historic core, for instance, that's where we would place the State House. And then there's sprawl, the city continuously expanding at the edges. The idea of the city being a new frontier with new opportunities. Political corruption associated with the city in different precincts in terms of voting. The development of identity and strong characteristics of ethnic neighborhoods. And then once again, just sort of restating these in terms of the thesis that I've provided you: new use of space, new types of energy, new class diversity, and so on. So before we get any further here, what I would like you to do at this point is pause this presentation and click on the link on the PDF version of your handout, which says Watch Urbanized Intro up to 7.5 minutes. There's a nice overview on the history of the city and urban space for you to take a look at there. Okay, so the State House is a prime example of a historic mode of architecture which we would associate with the Latin and Greek cultures, so we call it classical. And there are some significant elements that I would like you to label on a generally, abstract rendering of the State House as a shape in the box that's provided to you under the Urbanized link. It doesn't have to be 100% accurate or highly rendered, but I just want you to begin to build your vocabulary and be able to identify different modes of architectural language. So to begin with, we have on our list the arch, and here we have on the front of the building the Roman arch. The front of the building, we would also refer to that as its facade, F-A-C-A-D-E. And this row of arches, which provides cover for people entering or leaving the building. If it's raining or very sunny, it provides shade. this is called an arcade, which is the second label on your sheet. Obviously, these are columns, and they're done in the Corinthian style. There are three major orders of classical architecture, and Corinthian is one, Ionic is another, and the earliest is the Doric style. And those styles would determine the proportions of the rest of the building in terms of how the rest of the building would be proportioned to the arches and other components. And the columns. And this is like the arcade, a group of these columns in this fashion would be called a colonnade. At the top, we have a decorative element, a cupola. The flat columns, which you see here, that serve really no architectural support purposes, are called pilasters. They're more of a decorative element. The triangular shape right here is referred to as a pediment. And this lengthy ledge is a cornice, a dentiled cornice, as a matter of fact. Another thing about classical architecture is the use of visual enhancements. For instance, if you see the comparison of proportions of windows, the windows at the base level are larger than the windows in higher stories, and this makes the building appear taller and more dominant in the landscape. Here on Berkeley Street, a photo from 1875 shows the other major European historic program for architecture, which is known as the Gothic. And so we're going to follow along with the same exercise, a very basic sketch of one of these Gothic cathedrals. And you'll see on your list, the first thing is buttress. This is a buttress. It juts out from the building for support. Because these are load-bearing masonry buildings, you only have two ways of cutting passages and windows into them. One is the arch, and the Gothic arch is pointed at the top, and it distributes the weight around it into the base of the building. Similar, the Roman arch of the classical structures, also an engineering innovation that allows these buildings to have windows, doorways, etc. On larger cathedrals, the buttress would be a flying buttress, and it would actually come out from the building in this way, almost like a spider leg. We have the transept, which is not very apparent in this image, but if we were to extend the building beyond what is in front of it, you would have an intersecting structure. Which I'm just basically outlining. And it creates a cross shape. Which is where the cathedral's basic layout would be a religious function, and from an aerial view, it would resemble a crucifix, which is the symbol of Christianity and Catholicism. These are churches. And the nave would be the portion of the building where the actual ritual would occur. You have gables, which jut up through the roof line, these pointy aspects, and a pinnacle, which again is very vertical. The Gothic style in the United States was also known as the perpendicular style because everything was about height and enhancing the height of the structure. And on top of the pinnacle or the steeple, the pinnacles rather are these very severe gables that point upward. The steeple is the main um, sort of conical triangular shape that goes into the sky, and then on top of that would be a spire, usually some type of metal crucifix. And what's interesting about this image is you can see that every couple of blocks there was another parish. So the meeting house and the neighborhood parish were very important to early urban development in the United States. This is not only where religious activity would occur, but also sometimes political activity throughout most of U.S. history. On the other side of the street, you'll recognize the townhouses, and in particular, this one in the foreground, which is very much the classical style. We have the columns, a rounded pediment here, and the dentiled cornice. So both styles sort of confronting each other across these streets. Just a couple of other famous examples that you'll see walking around Boston. The Boston Public Library by McKim, Mead, and White, which was completed in 1888, 1889. A very Italianate structure that makes great use of the Roman arch. At Harvard University Memorial Hall by Warren Van Brunt, 1860, which is mostly Gothic in style, but does incorporate some classical elements. So we do have what we might call an eclectic approach to architecture, meaning picking and choosing from different styles of the past. Also sometimes referred to as Ruskinian Gothic. That name is an architectural and art critic, John Ruskin, who favored these types of elaborate combinations of different styles. Which brings us to Henry Hobson Richardson. Richardson is considered to be one of the first great American architects that produced new architecture in a uniquely American style, rather than just replicating what had been done in Europe. Now, initially, if you look at a structure here like his Trinity Church, which is in Copley Plaza, you'll see a lot of the things that we've already talked about. The Roman arches, the pinnacles from the Gothic style, the pavilions and different steeples that the Gothic structures would have. But what Richardson is actually doing is he's taking these old historical items and putting them in different proportions than they would normally be built in Europe, and being very eclectic in terms of combining different styles, the classical, the Gothic. Here's an aerial view of the church from the rear in the foreground, and then in the background you can see Boston Public Library just across Copley Plaza. So in the classical structure, you have very ordered, symmetrical style Italianate building, whereas Richardson's church is not symmetrical. It actually resembles a small city in and of itself, with the rectory and the church, and has a lot of different things going on in terms of balance and harmony. What Richardson would have said is that the asymmetry allows for the structure to be picturesque. It's not bound by rules, and it is something that you could approach on any side that would look three-dimensional and not flat. Richardson was also very interested in the function of the building. This term, this phrase, or this idiom, form follows function, was not Richardson's. It was a architect who admired Richardson later on, Louis Sullivan from Chicago. But Richardson was operating under the same philosophy. He didn't try to hide the function of the building underneath decoration or ornamentation. For instance, you see here there's a stairway, and Richardson allows you to see the stairway. It's not covered by the wall, and you're able to see the different internal functions of the building on the exterior. This becomes very important for Sullivan and the way that he designs buildings, because a lot of architects, once new technology comes in the 1890s, such as the steel frame, are still stuck in the past, building things with a steel frame, but covering them with stones to make them look like the buildings of old. For instance, the classical temple or the Gothic cathedral. Richardson also finds a lot of inspiration in basic vernacular American architecture, meaning the things that you would come across regularly. For instance, the typical salt box home regularly found in New England. You'll see these in early towns like Salem. They resemble what would have been kept in the kitchen to hold salt, so that's why they're referred to as a salt box. But what fascinated Richardson was the little amount of decoration on these structures, mostly because they're utilitarian and there weren't a lot of ornamental materials in the United States at the time these were built. The only thing we really have here is this little pediment that's over the front door. But what Richardson thought was honest and truthful about this architecture was that the materials served as the decorative elements. So we see these shingling materials on the exterior, in between the windows on the broad facade of the structure, the facade being the front here and the side. And Richardson loved the interplay between the texture of the mass, the spaces between the void, the windows, and he thought that was enough. That in the United States was becoming a very practical industrial economy, and that Richardson thought that the architecture should express that. Here's his Chestnut Hill train depot. So this is where people would go to catch the train, and it resembles these saltback homes, these early saltback homes. And you'll notice that the archway is very low to the ground, almost like a cave. So Richardson is trying to also dialogue with nature, as if this structure kind of grew up out of the ground. And then again, the only real decorative element we have is the texture of the stone on the side of the building. Here's another example in Easton, Massachusetts from 1855. Again, very low flung hipped roof over those cave-like arches, and very, very little decoration outside the texture of the stone. Very utilitarian as well. And his Marshall Fields building in 1885 in Chicago, which was a large mail order company headquarters. And again, he's reduced the structure to its stone. It's randomly coarse stone, meaning it's stone that's just broken out of the quarry and fit together like puzzle pieces. It's rough cut, it's not polished, and it has a rustication in certain places, meaning it was blasted to have a little bit more texture. And really that and the windows, again, the void and the mass are what provides any type of decoration to the building. Now, in most cities at this time, the tendency was not to build tall, because if we look at this typical structure, the Mariner's House in the North End neighborhood of Boston, built in 1847. This was an inexpensive boarding house for sailors who had come into port, and it's only about 5 stories high. You get an extra story at the top with these dormers for boarding. But why is this the case? Why not build tall? Well, this is a great example because if you look at the edges of the building, you'll see that there's another building right next to it on either side. So the taller you build, the thicker the foundation has to be. So if we're thickening the foundation and the support of the building, you'll notice that it's intruding upon square footage on the first floor, the first level, which most likely would have been a tavern, a shop, some type of business that would have paid a larger amount of rent for that square footage. So you don't want to lose that square footage to foundation blocks. And the further up you go in a building, the less rent, the less value there would be, because people have to climb stairs, there's fire hazard, elevators are not widely being used at this point. As a matter of fact, not really until they're used for construction. They have been used, elevators have been used all the way back to ancient Egypt, but they're not used safely in buildings and cities until after the Philadelphia Exposition of 1876, where Otis invents and displays the elevator safety brake, which will lock the elevator in place if a cable were to break so that you wouldn't plummet to your death in an elevator shaft. That's one of the key inventions of this period in the late 19th century that then changes things as far as building higher. You also can't, in this structure, if you didn't want to use a foundation, you're not able to use the buttresses that would have been associated with cathedrals, because again, you have buildings on either side of you, right up against the structure. This all changes when the steel frame is being used and replacing heavy load-bearing masonry. We have the opportunity to begin to build tall. The steel frame provides sort of like a spider web structure that distributes the weight of the structure all over the building and avoids this load-bearing masonry problem that I've just discussed. As a matter of fact, with William LeBaron Jenney, who builds the home insurance building in 1885, Chicago, one of the first steel frame buildings, what you'll notice right away is at the base, we have very large windows. Not possible with load-bearing masonry. You can't compromise the structure. Glass does not support large spans of steel or stone, rather, but the steel frame distributing the weight of the building all through this web-like structure allows the building to have big shop windows at the base where the public meets the building. So huge for retail. One of the things we talked about earlier in class is how this brings about the end of the mail order companies and the dawn of the department store in cities, and attracts people to the shop windows, the pedestrians. What's interesting about LeBaron Jenney is he understood the technology. He understood, actually, from watching Amish build wood frame barn houses, he figured out that with this new abundance of steel because of the industrial intensification in the late 19th century, that he could apply the Amish frame style of building to larger buildings in cities like Chicago. Unfortunately, if you look at the structure that results, he's not really able to comprehend what a tall building should look like necessarily. So he's building layers of buildings stacked on top of one another with these heavy cornices, and even including archways, which were not functional, and columns, which also were not functional. They're more decorative. And again, we have another layer of an arcade or an series of archways here, and then this heavy cornice at the top. So Le Barangeni is building still in the old traditions of European architecture and not able to express what the steel frame is allowing him to do in terms of modern building. Louis Sullivan changes that. Remember, I told you Sullivan's famous quotation, which was form follows function. And the building that he actually writes an essay about, the tall office building artistically considered, is the Guarantee Building, which is built in Buffalo, New York in 1894. And you'll notice it's quite different than Le Barangeni. Again, the bottom floor is totally glass for display of retail material. Once we get past this first two floors, what you'll see is a series of undifferentiated windows on a grid pattern, and every office is sort of the same. It's not differentiated, and the spandrels, which are these horizontal elements, are recessed behind the pilasters. See, this is why we did the exercise at the beginning, to get you a little bit used to using some architectural vocabulary so that we can talk about why what Sullivan is doing is different. So the vertical is enhanced, and we know that if you want something to look taller and thinner, you would put vertical stripes on it. And that's precisely what Sullivan is enhancing here. And also the decorative elements are merely the terracotta plates that are attached to the steel frame. So the steel frame determines the shape of the building. So again, it's that the form follows the function. You need an office building. We're going to use a steel frame to make an office building. It's going to look like an office building. And the decorative elements are just going to be attached to the steel frame. And terracotta is an interesting thing, an interesting choice here, because it can be mass produced. So you make a mold with either these geometric patterns, the chevrons, the diamonds, or maybe vegetation like we see here. And terracotta is nothing different than what you would put a common household plant in. And so it's clay. It can be stamped with one of these patterns. It's fired. It becomes very, very durable, and it's attached to the exterior of the building. Just around the corner from this building is the Ellicott Square building by Daniel Burnham, who is another Chicago architect, sort of a rival to Sullivan. And again, he's building with a steel frame here, and actually also using terracotta. But what Burnham has done is he's made the terracotta look like stone. He's painted it gray so that it looks like stone. And again, he's replicated all of the Greco-Roman classical architectural styles. So we don't really even recognize this as a steel frame building. And again, it's like layered like a wedding cake. In the entryway here, we have a large archway, some columns, actual statues of Mercury and Aphrodite on either side of the entry, and little Cupid heads at the top. And he really disrupts the verticality of the building with this layered look. Sullivan's building, this is actually almost the same height as Sullivan's building, but Sullivan's building appears taller. One other example, these are buildings all within a couple blocks of each other. The old post office building in 1897 by George Post also is a steel frame structure. but you would not know it from looking at it at the street level. It resembles a cathedral of the Gothic style. Just a few more examples of the influence of Sullivan. Eventually, Daniel Burnham catches up and begins building in the way that Sullivan prescribes in his essay, The Tall Office Building Artistically Considered. And what is born out of this is what is called the Chicago School of Architecture. And you can actually see in the Railway Exchange building very, very close mimicry of Sullivan's style, even with those sort of porthole windows punched into the top, into the cornice, to add emphasis to the height of the building. And before we move on to Sullivan's student, Frank Lloyd Wright, you may want to take a couple of minutes to read Sullivan's own words on your handout, and especially the highlighted portion, form ever follows function. Frank Lloyd Wright was Sullivan's student, his apprentice, and went off on his own. And one of his first major commissions was the Larkin Administrative Building in Buffalo in 1904. And I just put this up here. We're going to come back to Frank Lloyd Wright in a little bit, but before we get into his later career, what's interesting is his approach to the office building is very different than his teacher, Sullivan. This is one of the earliest open floor plans that Wright was experimenting with, where the offices were not sequestered behind cell-like walls, undifferentiated in size, but an open floor plan. As you can see, the entire center of the building is open in a large atrium. And the idea here with Wright was better than the practical outcome, which is often the case with a lot of Frank Lloyd Wright buildings, in that the lack of structure and walls would free the mind of the laborer. There would be a much more conducive spirit to working collaboratively and together. And of course, what happens is there's a lot of noise, a lot of distraction, and not functional situations. Later on in the 1970s, we even had a lot of school buildings that were built this way, without walls. And of course, what ended up happening is students and teachers, unable to conduct class because of noise and distraction, were basically stacking whatever they could find, bookshelves, trash bins, to create walls and more secluded spaces to conduct their work in their class. Just going to quickly run through some other notable steel frame buildings in New York City. This is the Singer Building, 1902, demolished in 1968. It was the tallest building to be destroyed up to that point in New York. So the need for space in New York is inexhaustible, and oftentimes building up is so valuable that even buildings that were relatively tall are cleared away to make way for even taller structures. Woolworth Building, 1917. Sort of a neo-Gothic. There are Gothic elements at the top, pinnacles, but it's a steel frame building, and you can see the structure being built on the right as well. The Flatiron Building, which is determined by the strange streetscape in lower Midtown Manhattan. Typically, Manhattan operated on a grid, but there are a few places in the lower part of the island where the streets create strange spaces, and this space is not going to be unused. Every inch of space in New York has to be used because of the value of that space. So the Flatiron Building is constructed. And because of the winds that would sweep down Broadway and 23rd Street, what would happen is there would be strange gusts on the southern end of the structure after it went around the sort of iron shape of it, the Flatiron shape, and create swirls and vacuums in the posterior of the building. And this would also create loitering, where people would hang around just to see one of these gusts of wind. In the early 1900s, laboring men or other men would hang around hoping that they would see the gusts maybe blow a woman's hat off or her skirt up, and this led to heavier police presence near the Flatiron Building. And the phrase 23 skidoo, which was a police phrase that meant skedaddle, stop loitering around 23rd Street. You're just a bunch of, street urchins, and we can't have vagrancy harassing the well-to-do women of the city. So, and then that phrase makes it into popular films from the 1920s and 1930s. The Winthrop Building in Boston is the first complete steel frame building. And again, I think it's an excellent example of the streets determining the shape of the building. Boston has some of the oddest streetscapes and intersections. And so the Winthrop Building is built to occupy a crescent-shaped space in the downtown area. If you go to Downtown Crossing, you'll be able to see this structure. Later on, structures, skyscrapers that have reduced their appearance to pure materials, glass and steel, like the Lever House on Park Avenue, becomes very influential throughout the world. It becomes known as the international style because you can go to any major city at any part in the world, whether it's if you go to Singapore or London or New York or Mumbai, you're going to see these expressions of the corporation of business, the steel and the glass curtain, as they call it. Other major structures built around the turn of the century: Grand Central Station, which is a steel frame structure but covered in granite. There was some concern, and it's been measured regularly since its construction, of the radiation. There's so much granite in the building that the stone might have high levels of radiation that may be problematic for people, but it is safe, relatively safe, as far as recent measurements have been taken. Of course, the Brooklyn Bridge, a stone pier and steel cable structure, overseen by John Augustus Roebling, who actually went into one of the cofferdams on an elevator. Cofferdams would be the deep spaces cut into the riverbed in the East River for these giant stone piers. And because of the change in elevation that happened so quickly on his way down, he got the bends and some of his blood vessels burst, and he was confined to watching the construction from an apartment on the east side of Manhattan in a wheelchair, and his wife actually oversaw the rest of the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge. Now, as buildings got taller, there was some concern that natural light, would not make its way to the pedestrian in the street. So a 1916 zoning law in New York City basically restricted massing to the height of the structure, which led to the development of a step back style of building that you can see in these renderings on the left. These renderings were delineated by the artist Hugh Ferris, and they had a lot of influence. His portfolio was called The Metropolis of Tomorrow, and the formula that is followed is in the lower right-hand corner about how high you can go before you have to set back the actual building to allow natural lighting to make its way into the street and the sidewalks. And these had influence not just on architectural design, but also science fiction films and cartoons, comic books, because of their dynamic energy. And Art Deco also evolved as a style from combining this geometric approach with iconography from other cultures, Egyptian iconography, indigenous iconography, to create a new style of architecture that was very, very drastically different than the earlier classical and Gothic motifs or genres from Europe. This Art Deco became very popular in New York, in Chicago, and in Paris. And the Chrysler Building is one of the most famous Art Deco structures. Buffalo City Hall, also a renowned Art Deco structure, seen in films, recent films. I think there's a recent film by Guillermo del Toro that utilizes this structure. Now, at this point, what I would like you to do is continue to look at Urbanized. You'll see that there's a link. We haven't talked about Jacob Riis and Jane Addams. We're going to come back to them, and also Frederick Law Olmsted. And part of the discussion on Urbanized from the 8-minute to the 12:40 mark is going to be about designing affordable housing for the population of working poor in Santiago, Chile. And we're looking here at an early attempt to design cheaper housing for the working poor in New York City called the dumbbell tenement, because overpopulation and immigration, migration, poverty were creating a lot of sanitary and health problems in the American cities of the early 20th century. And a lot of reformers, known as progressives at the time, had different philosophies and different ideas on how to solve these problems. One way was to create a tenement that was better designed, that provided air and lighting no matter where you were in the housing block, as you can see from this floor plan. So design alone does not repair the inequalities in a city. In the Santiago segment of Urbanized, you're going to see an attempt at what is called participatory design, and the results of that. And then I'm going to ask you to watch on through the 12:40 to the 24-minute mark, and think about the discussion of the City Beautiful movement and the Garden City and modernism as it is experimented with in Brasilia. And then finally, if you can get to it, the 29-minute mark to 37-minute mark, where the High Line in New York City is repaired or adaptively reused, and not as a train railway, which had been in disuse for many years, but now as a public park. And you'll end up there with a discussion of Jane Jacobs and Robert Moses. And this will prepare you for the guest lecture that we'll be having in H Block with Professor Max Page, Professor of Architecture from UMass Amherst.